When the peace president prepares for more war. Donald Trump once promised Americans something refreshingly simple: fewer wars, fewer funerals, fewer flag-draped coffins arriving in the quiet hours at Dover Air Force Base. He marketed himself as the president who would end stupid wars, disentangle America from the deserts and mountains of the Middle East, and return American soldiers home from missions that seemed to stretch indefinitely between victory and futility. Yet governing, as presidents eventually discover, has a way of revising campaign slogans. Today, the same man who once derided the architects of endless war now finds himself preparing Americans for something they were assured would see less of. Sacrifice. Not rhetorical sacrifice. Not the symbolic kind invoked in campaign speeches. But the literal sacrifice of Americans lives in combat. In a recent statement, President Trump offered the customary condolences for soldiers killed in action. Such language is familiar to anyone who has listened to a wartime president. Even as we continue the righteous mission for which they gave their lives, he said, we pray for the full recovery of the wounded and send our immense love and eternal gratitude to the families of the fallen. Then came the sentence that cut through the ritual solemnity, and sadly, there will likely be more. The phrase was delivered matter-of-factly, the way generals sometimes discuss attrition. Before the conflict ends, he explained, more Americans will die. That, he added with a shrugging realism rare in campaign rallies, is simply the nature of war. The irony is not subtle. The president who built his political brand as a critic of American interventionism now presides over a moment in which the nation must again confront the arithmetic of combat deaths. The peace president, it turns out, is preparing the public for war, the myth of the anti-war strongman. Donald Trump's political ascent was rooted in a rebellion against the foreign policy consensus that dominated Washington after the Cold War. For decades, both Republican and Democratic administrations shared a broad assumption that American power should be used liberally to maintain global order. Military force, humanitarian intervention, counterterrorism campaigns, and regime change operations became routine instruments of policy. Trump attacked that consensus with unusual ferocity. The Iraq War, he insisted, had been a catastrophic mistake. Afghanistan had turned into an endless quagmire. America, he argued, had been exploited by allies and entangled in conflicts that drained blood and treasure while delivering little in return. The message resonated with voters exhausted by 2 decades of war. In rallies across the United States, Trump promised a foreign policy guided by 3 principles: America first, avoid unnecessary wars, destroy enemies quickly rather than occupying their countries. It was not isolationism exactly. Trump never claimed that America should retreat from the world entirely. But he framed intervention as a transactional calculation. If military action did not clearly benefit the United States, it was not worth the cost. The pitch was politically potent. Many Americans who disliked foreign wars also disliked appearing weak. Trump's solution was elegantly simple: be ruthless, when necessary, but avoid the sprawling occupations that had defined earlier conflicts. In theory, it sounded like a middle path between interventionism and withdrawal. In practice, the world rarely cooperates with tidy theories. War by another name. The paradox of Trump's presidency is that while he condemned large-scale wars, he rarely rejected the use of force itself. Instead, he embraced a different model: limited, punitive, high-intensity strikes. Rather than occupying countries, the United States would launch devastating blows against enemies, terrorist networks, insurgent groups, or hostile states, and then step back. The approach promised the spectacle of strength without the burden of nation-building. It was warfare designed for the television age: precision airstrikes, drone campaigns, special operations raids, cyber attacks, economic sanctions, all tools that could inflict punishment while minimizing the visible footprint of American troops. Yet even this restrained form of warfare carries risks. Missiles can escalate conflicts. Air campaigns can provoke retaliation. Special operational missions sometimes require conventional forces to support them. And once American soldiers are deployed into hostile territory, casualties become a statistical certainty, which brings the president to his present dilemma: limited wars still produce dead soldiers. Preparing the public, presidents seldom speak openly about the likelihood of future casualties. Political language usually prefers euphemisms, risk, danger, or the price of freedom. Trump's phrasing was unusually blunt: there will likely be more. The statement performs an important political function: it prepares the public psychologically for losses that have not yet occurred. Casualties are easier to accept if the public has been warned, but the statement also signals something else: the administration expects the conflict to continue long enough, and intensely enough, that additional deaths are almost inevitable. In modern American warfare, casualties are rare compared with earlier eras. Precision technology, air power, and intelligence advantages have dramatically reduced battlefield losses. When American soldiers do die, it often indicates one of two things: 1. The conflict is expanding; 2. The enemy remains capable of striking back. Either possibility undermines the comforting narrative of quick, surgical operations, the rhetoric of retribution. Trump paired his warning about casualties with another familiar theme: vengeance. America will avenge their deaths, he declared, promising the most punishing blow against terrorists waging war on civilization itself. Such language has deep roots in American wartime rhetoric. Presidents frequently frame military action as a moral response to aggression rather than a strategic calculation. Revenge is politically effective: it transforms grief into resolve and converts casualties into justification for escalation. The deaths of soldiers become proof that the enemy must be defeated, but vengeance also contains a trap: every retaliatory strike invites another response. Each escalation justifies the next. What begins as punishment can gradually evolve into a wider war. History provides many examples. The United States entered Vietnam gradually: first advisors, then combat units, then hundreds of thousands of troops. Afghanistan began as a targeted counterterrorism mission before expanding into a 20-year campaign to stabilize an entire country. Wars rarely expand because leaders initially intend them to; they expand because each step seems reasonable at the time. The political utility of fallen soldiers. In democratic societies, military casualties carry a complicated political meaning. On one hand, they are tragedies that demand national mourning. On the other hand, they can serve as powerful symbols used to rally public support for continued conflict. Trump's statement reflects this dual purpose. He expressed sympathy for the families of the fallen. But he also used their deaths to justify intensifying the campaign. This is not unique to Trump. Every wartime president has done something similar. Casualties create a narrative: soldiers did not die in vain, therefore, the mission must continue until victory is achieved. The logic is emotionally persuasive, even if strategically ambiguous. Once soldiers have died, withdrawing from a conflict can appear dishonorable. Continuing the war becomes a way to honor their sacrifice. This dynamic often traps governments in conflicts longer than originally intended: the American public and the tolerance for loss. One of the defining features of modern American warfare is the country's low tolerance for casualties. During the Second World War, the United States lost more than 400,000 soldiers. The public accepted the sacrifice as necessary for victory. Today the political threshold is dramatically lower: a few hundred casualties can provoke national debate. A few thousand can transform public opinion entirely. This shift reflects several changes in American society. The military is now an all-volunteer force, meaning most citizens have no direct connection to combat. Modern media coverage makes each casualty highly visible. Long wars without clear victories erode public patience. Presidents therefore face a delicate balancing act. They must project determination while ensuring that losses remain limited enough to sustain political support. Trump's warning about future casualties suggests that the administration expects the conflict to evaluate that balance. The strategic ambiguity of victory. Trump's rhetoric promises decisive punishment against terrorists. Yet the strategic objective remains vague. What exactly would victory look like? Destroying terrorist groups entirely is notoriously difficult. Organizations can fragment, rebrand, and relocate across borders. Killing leaders often produces successors. Military force can degrade such networks but rarely eliminates them completely. The war on terrorism has demonstrated this repeatedly. Al-Qaeda weakened but survived. ISIS lost its territorial caliphate but continues to operate as a dispersed insurgency. Numerous smaller groups persist across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. If victory is defined as total eradication, the war may never truly end. If it is defined as containment, the conflict becomes permanent. Either outcome implies continued military engagement, and therefore the possibility of more American deaths. The burden of credibility. Trump's political identity complicates the situation further. Because he positioned himself as an opponent of endless wars, any expansion of military conflict risks accusations of hypocrisy. Critics argue that the peace president has merely replaced large occupations with perpetual limited warfare. Supporters counter that decisive strikes are preferable to nation-building campaigns. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Trump has indeed avoided the kind of massive ground invasions that characterized earlier administrations. But the United States remains deeply engaged in global military operations. The difference is not the absence of war, but the scale and style of war. From a strategic standpoint, limited wars can be sustainable for extended periods precisely because they require few troops, but sustainability does not equal resolution. Conflicts can smolder indefinitely. The moral arithmetic of warfare. Every military campaign involves a grim calculation. How many lives are worth the objective being pursued? Governments rarely state this calculation explicitly, but it shapes every decision about escalation or withdrawal. Trump's acknowledgement that more Americans may die suggests that the administration believes the stakes justify the cost. The question is whether the public will agree. Modern Americans often support military action in principle but recoil when casualties rise. This creates a paradox. Voters demand security yet resist the sacrifices required to achieve it. Presidents therefore frame wars as both necessary and limited, necessary enough to justify action, limited enough to reassure the public that losses will remain manageable. Trump's statement precisely attempts this balance, acknowledging the likelihood of casualties while promising overwhelming retaliation against the enemy. The irony of the peace president. The deeper irony lies not in Trump's rhetoric but in the structural realities of American power. Any president of the United States inherits a vast global security apparatus, alliances, military bases, counterterrorism commitments, and strategic rivalries. These commitments generate conflicts automatically. Even leaders who wish to reduce military involvement find themselves responding to crises that threaten American interests or allies. The result is a recurring pattern in American politics. Candidates campaign against war. Presidents manage it. Trump is hardly the first to experience this transformation. Barack Obama entered office promising to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to authorize drone campaigns and new military operations against ISIS. George W. Bush initially advocated a humble foreign policy before the attacks of September 11 transformed his presidency into one defined by global counterterrorism. The office reshapes the occupant. The future of the conflict. What happens next depends on two factors: the resilience of the enemy and the political tolerance of the American public. If the conflict remains limited, sporadic strikes, occasional casualties, the administration may sustain support indefinitely. But if the enemy escalates, targeting American forces or allies more aggressively, the United States may face pressure to respond with greater force. Such escalations can occur quickly. Wars often expand not through deliberate planning but through cycles of retaliation. Each side believes it is responding defensively, even as the conflict grows. A familiar American story. In many ways, the current moment feels eerily familiar. A president promises decisive action against a dangerous enemy. Military operations begin with confidence and technological superiority. Early casualties are mourned but framed as part of a righteous mission. Then the question that haunts every war emerges: how long will it last? Trump's warning that there will likely be more suggests the administration is already preparing the public for a conflict that will not end quickly. It is a subtle shift in tone, from triumphant certainty to cautious realism. The price of power. For all its technological sophistication, American military power cannot eliminate the fundamental reality of war. People die. Soldiers die. Civilians die. And presidents must explain why those deaths were necessary. Trump's statement reflects that burden. He offered condolences, promised revenge, and acknowledged the likelihood of further losses. In doing so, he joined a lengthy line of American presidents who have stood before the nation and attempted to reconcile patriotism with tragedy. The irony, of course, is that this role belongs not to a reluctant warrior but to the man who once promised to end America's wars. The peace president's paradox. Donald Trump still describes himself as a president who prefers peace to war. And he may well believe it, yet the paradox of American leadership is that peace often requires the readiness for violence, and sometimes the willingness to accept casualties. Trump's message to the nation reflects this uncomfortable truth. Even a peace president must sometimes ask Americans to risk their lives, and sometimes, he must ask them to accept that some will not come home.